Have you ever gotten really worked up about a particular issue? Maybe it was dealing with a family problem or even a theoretical political idea, and then a few weeks later you look into that very same issue and realize you were wrong. That's always a strange feeling, isn't it? You look back and realize you doubled down on an idea that turned out to be false. It can be very humbling, but what if you never get the chance to step away from the issue and come back with a clear mind? What if this one particular issue is the only thing you can think about? It consumes your entire mind, and you're so blinded by that passion for your idea that you completely ignore it, failing every step of the way. This is exactly what happened to Joseph Stalin. Communism, Marxist Leninism, it sounded very promising to a lot of people. The redistribution of wealth and the liberation of the working class people. A government truly run and controlled by the very people who live under that government. Communism promised all this and more. But what happened in Russia when they finally got to live in this communistic paradise Marx spoke so highly of? The worst collective suffering humanity has ever endured. Do you even want to know some of the estimates for civilian deaths under Stalin? There are some that are as high as 61 million people. 61 million deaths of ordinary people, families, children, women, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, lovers. That's not military deaths. These are ordinary citizens just trying to live their lives, and 61 million of them were killed under Stalin's regime. That number balloons when you start taking into account military deaths and the deaths of people who had communist revolutions in their own countries as a result of Stalin's involvement. We'll never know exactly how many people died, but the number is unimaginable. The very next question I ask is what on earth could have happened to this poor soul to bring him to do such a terrible thing? What needs to happen to a human being to make them capable of killing millions of innocent people? And I don't buy the whole "he was just crazy" thing. That's a load of dismissive bullshit. You can never understand the dark side of human beings by calling it crazy. Insanity is not an excuse for genocide. Some other history podcasts can use this crazy excuse, but not here. Because this episode is going to take a deep dive into this monster, this human being, Joseph Stalin, and by the end of this, you will understand the why. Without any further ado, the life of Joseph Stalin. Hey guys, ErickAlden here. I just wanted to let you know, Biocast is not the only podcast I do. You can find a bunch of really great in-depth podcast episodes on the Dark History Podcast as well. You can find more information and free content on ourdarkhistory.com. Thank you so much. Please enjoy the rest of the show. Whenever I do an episode on someone as controversial as Joseph Stalin, I feel the need to include a disclaimer, just to let you know I'm not a pinko or a communist sympathizer or anything like that. Here on Biocast, I do my absolute best job to get an understanding of the human side to the people we cover here. Did Joseph Stalin kill lots of people? Yes. Was he directly responsible for the deaths of millions? Yes. But that doesn't change the fact that he was a living, breathing human being just like you or me. Especially as an American, or just as a Westerner in general, it becomes so difficult to put yourself in someone like Stalin's shoes. From the first time we ever hear about him in history class, it's always presented in an almost comic book-like fashion, very similarly to the way Hitler is presented. It's a lot like Star Wars, actually. Darth Vader is first shown to you as the most evil person in existence, massacring weaker enemies, destroying entire planets, even abusing his own people. You're not supposed to sympathize with Darth Vader. He's just evil, and there's no redeeming qualities to him. It isn't until almost 40 years later, in the prequel, you find out he was once Anakin Skywalker. And once upon a time, he was one of the good guys. But you only ever see this human side knowing he's eventually gonna turn out to be the ultimate evil. It's a lot harder to sympathize with a character that you know is going to become the biggest bad guy in the universe. It's a very similar situation with Stalin. I'm sure you've seen a documentary or a video about his life, but here's what I want you to do with this podcast episode. Put yourself in his shoes. Listen on as if his life could have gone anywhere with infinite possibilities. Forget who he became later in life and constantly ask yourself questions like, how would I have responded in this situation? Or, what would I have done if this happened to me? Questions like that are how you can develop a real understanding of history. You can sit here all day long and tell me every single fact about Stalin's life from beginning to end, but it's all a waste if you've never sat down and did your absolute best job to empathize with and understand him. Knowing where he went to school and his opinion on this or that policy can be helpful, but it doesn't get you to understand what made him tick, or how he became who he was, what his values were. Those are the kinds of things that are important. Joseph Stalin was born in Georgia, which was then a territory of the Russian Empire, with a name that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. I'm just going to refer to him as Stalin throughout this, so you know who I'm talking about. He goes through a couple different identity shifts and his name changes each time, so for simplicity's sake, we'll just stick with Stalin because that's how we all know him. He was born to a family of peasants, and his childhood is actually quite interesting. As is almost always the case of someone who becomes a genocidal dictator, his home life was rifled with abuse. His father was physically abusive. Commonly known as Beso, he had aspirations of owning a shoe shop. Things didn't exactly pan out that way. His shop completely failed. It was an absolute disaster. And to cope with that failure, he turned to alcohol. And it would be in these drunken fits of rage he would beat his wife and only son. You can imagine the relief the family felt when this abusive drunk died an extraordinarily early death. Stalin was 11 years old at this point, and his father's death really put him in a weird position. The way society was set up was that you just became what your father had been. Your job was hereditary. But due to his father's failure and early death, there really wasn't any kind of position to inherit. The real hope for Stalin came from his mother. She was determined to set him up for a good life, and it really looked like he had a chance at that. He got amazing grades, often at the top of his class. However, he was also very, very poorly behaved. He would fight, disobey teachers, and all things of the sort. A childhood classmate later wrote Stalin was, quote, the best, but also the naughtiest pupil, end quote. Another weird aspect to his childhood is this perpetual illness. He faced several severe health problems, almost died a few times. He got smallpox, which left him with facial scars. He got hit by one of those horse carriages one time. Most Stalin biographers believe this was the cause of a lifelong disability to his left arm. All these things added up and took a toll. They changed him. Exactly how is up for debate, but they definitely impacted him. But as far as I'm concerned, he wasn't totally lost at any point. He still had hope for redemption, or to at least live a halfway normal life. Maybe could have used his interest in politics to have contributed in a meaningful and peaceful way. This is a kid who's writing poetry, gets good grades, had a natural interest in things like nature and patriotism. One of Stalin's biographers even notes how his little poems became minor Georgian classics, appearing in many anthologies over the coming years. And let's not forget, this is also a kid who likes to fight. This isn't your typical alone in the bedroom, reading and writing kind of kid. This is the oftentimes highest scoring kid in the class who also likes to fist fight at recess. There's a story from one of his childhood friends where he claims that Stalin was riding on the back of one of his classmates and yelling to the world, quote, "I am steel! I am steel!" End quote. It kind of shows you that even at a young age, and despite being physically handicapped in more than one way, Stalin understood his physical power. He won most fights he got into. There are also descriptions of him being hard, insensitive, lacking consideration for those around him. And something I do want to address is the question as to whether or not Stalin was born sociopathic, or born without the ability to sympathize with others. There are a lot of people who make this claim, and I have my own take on it. I'll let you make your own decision for yourself, but calling Stalin a sociopath removes him from humanity in a way. This is a group of people who are already kind of considered others. There's an almost natural desire to find and emphasize any difference between us, or the normal segment of the human population, and someone like Stalin. Like, let's take this person who we consider to be evil and place him in as many other categories as humanly possible. The same can be said of Hitler or Mao or insert any genocidal dictator. Historians and others alike try and argue that these men were crazy or gay or drug addicts or they were missing sexual organs or something that just makes them different from us. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but these guys were exactly like us. They were human beings too, and calling these guys a bunch of names doesn't change a single thing. Not one. Especially in Stalin's case. He may have been a bit cold, kind of rude to people around him, maybe, but it's really hard to argue that he was a sociopath. When Stalin was 16, he was sent to seminary school with the hope of becoming a parish priest. This school was in the capital of Georgia, and for a small town kid with no dad, this was kind of a big deal. Despite his mother sacrificing a heck of a lot to educate him, he eventually lost interest in school. He became increasingly radical, reading a bunch of revolutionary material, and he completely bought into these ideas. He proclaimed himself an atheist, which wouldn't have been a big deal anywhere else, but in a seminary school where you're studying to be a priest, kind of problematic. His grades dropped. He would disrespect the monks who provided him with a very generous scholarship, understanding he came from a poor family, and his behavior was even bad enough that they had to put him in a cell at times. What? I know, that's exactly what I thought when I read that too. They were pretty strict, and he eventually stopped going, but no one is exactly sure how he stopped going. Theory number one is that his mother pulled him out and took him home. She wrote that a doctor advised her that Stalin was going to contract tuberculosis, and so she took her only son back home. This is at least according to Stalin's mother. Theory number two, Stalin was expelled from seminary for reading scientific material. I'm sure you could understand why a communist would make this claim, even if he knew it was false. This kind of paints the old regime as a crooked, anti-scientific dictatorship and casts Stalin in a good light, makes him look like a good kid. Kinda makes him a martyr for science, even. Sounds a lot better than getting kicked out for being mischievous. This is at least the account according to Yanukidze. I'm going to apologize because that's probably the wrong pronunciation, and I'm also going to apologize for all the other wrong pronunciations throughout this episode. And then finally, theory number 3 is that he just left on his own accord. By this point, he was already a self-proclaimed Marxist and a member of a socialist political group, which is kinda at odds with the church, so make of that what you will. I think there could definitely be an agenda behind theory number 1 and definitely theory number 2. Theory number 3, though, where he just kinda leaves on his own, makes the most sense, at least from a politically neutral standpoint. And there's a very powerful parallel between Stalin and Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, if you listen to the Biocast episode about Napoleon, you will remember he didn't exactly fit in with the other Frenchmen, because he spoke French wrong. He had a terrible accent, and it created a natural divide between him and the true French people he was surrounded by. The same was true for Stalin. Despite his every attempt to erase his cultural background, he still had this thick Georgian accent that would follow him the rest of his life. A Soviet biographer who wrote a book on Stalin even noted Stalin's speaking style as, quote, simple and clear without flights of fancy, catchy phrases or platform histrionics, end quote. This inability to really speak to the people he ruled over probably caused even more of a divide between them. Just think about our ruling class today. How far removed do you feel from President Trump or House Speaker Pelosi? And these are people we can understand when they speak. Imagine how much more distance it creates between you and them when you throw on a thick Spanish accent, for example. Imagine every time Nancy Pelosi spoke, she did it where you felt like you needed a translator. It makes you, the people, feel more distant from your leadership. And I'm sure it would create distance for the person in power too. I'd even go as far to say that it would make it easier to kill a population you have nothing in common with. More on that shortly. After he was out on his own, he spent the next few years reforming his sense of identity. Everything had to be changed. He was completely separated from his Georgian heritage and now only associated himself with Marxism. He's gone through a few different names, but it's right around this time that he got the name that stuck, Stalin, which literally translates to Man of Steel. He was obsessed with his public perception and always wanted to be a feared leader. He would most certainly live up to the name in the coming years. He became infatuated with communism by this point. It was the only thing he lived for. He was independent for a short time, supporting himself with a job as a meteorologist, but he lost that job after trying to start a revolution. To escape arrest, he was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, sleeping in different apartments, changing his name, living off donations from friends and sympathizers. He really didn't want to get arrested. In November of 1901, he traveled to a Georgian city, Batumi, located on the coast of the Black Sea. Despite narrowly escaping arrest, he continued with his militant rhetoric. And here's the wild part. Stalin was so crazy that other Marxists thought he was an agent provocateur. That should give you an idea as to how out there Stalin's ideas really were. He briefly found employment at a Rothschild refinery, which has been the subject of many conspiracy theories, many of which are interesting, but this is not necessarily the place to discuss that. After leading 2 separate socialist demonstrations, Stalin was finally arrested, spending a few years in prison before being exiled to Far East Siberia for 3 years. Now, Siberia has historically played this role as the vast penal colony for Russia. There are seemingly endless miles of freezing territory that you realistically can't escape from. Once you leave the safety of your little prison, good luck finding your way back to civilization. It was such an effective strategy for dealing with prisoners that Russians have been doing this since the 1600s. Want to know why Russia was one of the last to lose its autocratic government? Because they had this wonderful place to send critics away. It was especially bad during the Soviet era. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who you should know, he was in one of these USSR gulags. He actually quoted an older Russian writer from the 1860s, but not in a way that you would expect. He did it to illustrate how much worse the conditions had gotten under the Soviets. Siberia plus communism was a bad meets evil type of situation in a lot of ways. So Stalin's stay in Siberia could have been much, much worse. But not too long into his stay, and this should be a testament to how strong-willed he was, Stalin escaped, made it all the way back to the Georgian capital, and went right back to the communist scene. But something had drastically changed during his exile. The party had split. It was between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. There wasn't actually a lot of ideological difference between the two groups, aside from the fact that the Mensheviks were a little bit more moderate. The Mensheviks were prepared to work with the liberals in Russia, and they had doubts about the use of violence. They didn't necessarily want to go out and hurt a bunch of people and become too radical for the majority of the population. The Bolsheviks, though, were hardline revolutionaries that would stop at no measure to achieve their goals. I'm sure you could see how Stalin became infatuated with Bolshevik idealism. The Mensheviks were still communists, but it may have been less brutal had they won power and cooperated with other political groups in a civilized manner. It could have prevented a lot of death. Unsurprisingly, Stalin despised the Mensheviks, couldn't stand them. He's supposed to have once said about them, quote, "All means are justified against them," end quote. There was also another division amongst the communists where many of the more noble and moral communists correctly identified the outright crooks in the movement. Stalin very obviously fell into this crook corner. I mean, the guy literally just escaped prison, and when political disagreements came up, the entire party was just in absolute chaos. Someone who witnessed everything unfold described a particular event that should give you an idea of how things went. Quote, "The agrarian question was at the time exciting hot discussions, in which the antagonists sometimes came to blows. I shall never forget an agrarian debate organized by Koba, at which his comrade, Sergo, had brought home his conclusion by striking his fellow speaker, the socialist revolutionary Ilya, in the face, for which he received a thorough thrashing from the social revolutionaries." End quote. The communist political scene was completely chaotic. The perfect opportunity for someone like Joseph Stalin to position himself in such a way that he could personally benefit. While this is all going on, the Tsarist regime makes a terrible mistake. Actually, many mistakes, but one really big one. You see, most people were still loyalists, or at least not displeased enough to actually do anything about it. But conditions for the people were bad. Wages were low, capitalists were exploiting the workers, and it became nearly impossible to make a living. So, the people protested in St. Petersburg, and they did so in good faith. They just simply believed the Tsar wasn't aware of what was going on here, and if we just let him know, everything will be taken care of. This idea came crashing down. The Tsar wasn't even at his palace that day, and to make matters worse, his soldiers began firing upon the crowd. There were somewhere between 143 and 234 deaths, up to 800 injuries, and just under 7,000 arrests. The people got the Tsar's message loud and clear. This event has gone down as Bloody Sunday, and many point to it as the event that made communism inevitable. The Tsarist regime's shortcomings certainly helped the communist revolutionaries in a lot of ways. Getting back to Stalin though, he continues to support himself with less and less reputable means. One of them being where he outright robs people. There was one time where he robbed a bank, made off with millions of dollars in today's money, in rubles. He killed about 50 people in the process, and it turned out all of these innocent people died for nothing, because the notes were in all these gigantic bills. It would be the equivalent of having $1 million bill. There are so few in circulation that they're useless if you get them illegally. The government is going to know exactly where you spent them. It was around this time that Stalin started positioning himself as Lenin's young protege. He began putting in a lot of hours in the Bolshevik Central Committee and various other forms of communist bureaucracy. He ends up imprisoned in Siberia, again, only to break out after 2 short months. He went right back to writing communist material for left-leaning newspapers. It was during this time that he wrote his most famous article, Marxism and the National Question. This was published under the pseudonym of K. Stalin. He'd been using this name since about 1912, but it wasn't until he published this article that the name Stalin had some real power behind it. I'm going to fast forward a bit here because there's a lot of detail I could go into, but it's really not pertinent to the story. In short, Stalin's next few years are spent promoting communist propaganda, encouraging a civil war, and climbing the ranks within the party. World War I had been a huge blow to the credibility of the Tsarist regime. Not only was it fighting a political war it really had no personal stake in, but it was going up against countries that were way more industrialized than Russia. It takes a blow to your nation's psyche if you fight smaller countries with lower populations and you get destroyed time and again. Bismarck's German Empire was a force to be reckoned with. You have all these military blunders, and then the Tsar leaves to command the troops himself, which, in retrospect, was probably the worst thing he could have done, because now you lose 5,000 soldiers in a day and lose 10 feet of ground to the enemy. The people can directly blame you. You can't just scapegoat the generals anymore. This is because of you, our leader. It wasn't long before Russia had to withdraw from the war, and right around this time, Russia becomes a republic dominated by liberals, and I mean liberals in the classical sense. Most communists see them as enemies at this time, and still to this day kind of do. This prompted Stalin to give his own take on these events, releasing an editorial in the Marxist newspaper Pravda, explaining, quote, "The existing government of landlords and capitalists must be replaced by a new government, a government of workers and peasants. The existing pseudo-government, which was not elected by the people and which is not accountable to the people, must be replaced by a government recognized by the people, elected by representatives of the workers, soldiers, and peasants, and held accountable to their representatives." End quote. This did exactly what you'd expect it to. It stirred the pot for revolution. And here's the really smart strategic thing about the communists. You see, they weren't the only group of people under the Russian government that wanted to overthrow and install themselves leaders. There's always a competition to establish control over a country that just went through a major political change. What the communists did was they allowed all these other rivaling factions to fight each other, and then after all these other groups had worn themselves down, the communists stepped in and seized control of the government. By the time the communists established control over Russia, there are 3 leading prominent figures: Stalin, Trotsky, and Lenin. Lenin is the big shot of the USSR. He's more or less the ideological foundation, as well as the person who gets to implement that ideology. Trotsky was in charge of the military, despite never having served, and Stalin was rising up as a chief bureaucrat. Stalin was basically Lenin's number 2. And here's the interesting relationship dynamic between Stalin and Lenin. Stalin was a great admirer of Lenin, at least initially. Whenever he gave speeches, he really had 2 people he would quote from, and that was Lenin and Marx. Stalin was even one of the few people who had direct access to Lenin when he took control of Russia. But the more they worked together, the more conflict arose between them. There were a couple of times where Stalin really failed on his part. Sometimes this was a military matter, and other times it had to do with international trade. Lenin once called Stalin not intelligent, and it would be around this time that Stalin would develop a real hatred for his beloved leader. And here's the really interesting thing about how everything went down. So Stalin's wife was Lenin's secretary. Stalin ordered his wife to spy on Lenin and let him know when he was sick, when he was feeling ill, about personal matters, what he was saying to his friends. She would even read his personal letters. That's how deep the manipulation and the lies and the deception went. Extremely Machiavellian. It's almost kind of scary if you think about it. This is someone that's supposed to be your comrade, your friend, and they're using their spouse to spy on you. By the time the 1920s are rolling around, their relationship is really in a bad place. There was an incident where Stalin was rude to Lenin's wife over the phone. What exactly he said to her, we'll never really know for sure, but it was something severe enough that Lenin criticized Stalin for being rude. And now, as Stalin is beginning to die, he understands that this communist dream, this great visionary test, is going to fail because he's going to die with this idea. So what he does is he sets out a final testament, a final document instructing his successors on what exactly they need to do, how they need to do it, and how they're going to make this thing work. This is supposed to be how people continue the proletariat revolution in the future. He has a few really interesting things to say in this document. One of them is that Stalin should be removed from his position of general secretary. He basically says that Stalin is power hungry, which is kind of true. He sees it for how it is. And what happens next is a testament to the kind of person that Joseph Stalin had really grown into. You can see the true cult of personality and deception that he was capable of really come to life during this next segment. Lenin dies, and when news had broken that Lenin had died, Stalin talked to Trotsky, told him not to worry about it. Trotsky was very obviously sad over the death. Stalin basically told him, "Listen man, don't worry, I'm going to take care of it, you just take a few days off, I know he was your friend, I'm going to handle everything." And then he goes to the funeral against the wishes of Lenin's widow, and starts giving speeches, and he's going to universities and giving lectures on the foundations of Leninism. He positions himself as the logical successor of Vladimir Lenin. Now, this all flies in the face of this terrible relationship that they had between each other, where they mistrusted each other, and where Lenin literally wrote out that he didn't want Stalin to even hold the position that he had, let alone rise up through the ranks. During the time, there were a lot of people that supported Lenin, and now when Stalin positions himself as the next logical successor, all of those people now jump on board with Stalin. This is a really smart move for a couple of reasons. For one, it's a brilliant propaganda move because when everyone's coming together to mourn the death of their beloved leader, Trotsky is nowhere to be found. Trotsky was one of the few people that could have been in competition to Stalin, and now that he's not at the funeral, people kind of get the perception that he doesn't really care and wasn't really that close to Lenin to begin with, and hey, maybe this guy isn't even a true comrade after all. Now, after establishing himself as the undisputed ruler of the newly established USSR, Stalin becomes increasingly paranoid. There's an old idea that says the negative traits within you paint the world that you see. So let's say you're a really greedy person. You're going to see greed everywhere you go in the world. It's a form of projection. Stalin, because he was so Machiavellian and deceptive, believed that at any moment he was going to face some kind of mutiny or be overthrown. Kinda like the way he took power himself. As you can imagine, being the ruler of such an enormous country, especially the first communist country in existence, comes with a certain level of stress, and on top of the very demanding hours and workload that come along with this new position, he also has to worry about people doing to him what he did to Lenin. And there's a very good chance most of the people who ended up in Siberian gulags for allegedly planning to stab Stalin in the back had absolutely no intention of overthrowing him or anything like that. Most of it was probably just in his head. Around 1927, Stalin believed that he was depressed. He had constant feelings of inferiority, alleged threats to his feelings of grandeur, and a whole boatload of mental baggage. So, what he did was he went to a renowned Russian psychiatrist. This psychiatrist's name was Vladimir Bekhterev. He travels all the way to the Kremlin to help Stalin. After his visit, he returned back to where he worked. There he said to his colleagues, quote, "I have just examined a paranoiac with a short, dry hand." End quote. The next day, he was found dead. And keep in mind, this was someone who was very influential in the field of psychiatry. This isn't some peasant taken off the streets. This is a renowned psychiatrist from St. Petersburg University who's a rival of Ivan Pavlov. It wasn't that long after this little incident that Bekhterev's name is erased from Soviet textbooks, and it wasn't long after this little incident that Bekhterev's name is erased from Soviet textbooks. It was as if he had never existed. No one can say anything for sure, but the leading theory on what happened here goes something like this. Bekhterev gave Stalin a diagnosis that he did not like, and this would be one of the first of many, many individuals who would be found dead and then disappear from history altogether. But Stalin's mental well-being was the least of his problems, and he was quickly realizing that the USSR was years behind any other developed nation, and it was like this in every industry from metalwork to the extraction of natural resources and factories and food production, and communism's inefficiency was really starting to show itself. Instead of admitting that the new economic policy that Lenin had passed was inefficient and did not create the abundance of wealth that everyone hoped for, Stalin instead blamed an entire class of people. These were the independent farmers. They were called kulaks. These were essentially people who were born into peasantry, who were able to make something of themselves by owning land and being a productive farmer. Stalin alleged that these kulaks were hoarding their surplus grain and starving the nation. This led to a collectivization of all the farms in the Soviet Union. They divided the farms by a certain number of people. The absolute bare minimum required to work that farm or able to live on that farm. Of course, this didn't take into account worker efficiency, productivity, and competence. The rest of the population was forced into the larger cities where they worked in factory jobs. So not only were the farmers not able to function properly because they lost a good portion of their people they needed to work there, but all of these peasants who had only ever been farmers for their entire lives and even generations back were now forced into the city to do something that they've never done before and probably didn't want to do in the first place. Stalin took a lot of people out of their natural element in an attempt to mimic the economic conditions of the West. It did not take long for famine to sweep across the nation. There were dozens of requests for the redistribution of food to various regions all over the Soviet Union. People were starving to death everywhere. Stalin used the Red Army to suppress any uprisings and then blamed the uprisings on local officials who had rebelled against communism. Now, as you can imagine, the Soviet Union was in a state of absolute chaos. This was not a good place to live, and this was a particularly bad time to be there. And despite all of the chaos, murder, death, and starvation, Joseph Stalin was still able to bring the Soviet Union to the level of industrialization that it so desperately needed to be taken seriously as a nation. There's a very strong likelihood that if Stalin had not done what he had done, when World War II eventually breaks out, the Axis powers have a much better chance of winning that war, and probably do win that war. Especially considering the Soviet Union was really the only significant Allied power. I think most Westerners, especially people that are American citizens or Brits, we've kind of been taught a version of history where our role was significantly more ramped up than it actually was. The Soviet Union did the vast majority of the fighting and dying, and after the war, the colonization. And none of it would have happened had Stalin not gone through this painful version of industrialization, or, as people have called it, Stalinization. I don't mean to downplay the suffering of the people under Stalin because there was so much of that occurred. I remember hearing a quote somewhere about Stalin and his Stalinization process that I thought was really fitting. Stalinization is good for industrialization the same way cannibalism is a good way to get a high-protein diet. I think that gives you a really good idea of how terrible these policies really were for the Russian people. But it goes beyond just the policies that Stalin had put in place. The people carrying out those policies were also evil in a way that only an extreme governmental psychopath can be. I don't even know what to say about that. And I'm not just talking about Stalin here, I mean the people who were in charge of local governments and smaller areas, like just the people that had power in general, were evil. One of the early Bolshevik revolutionaries, Nikolai Bukharin, who was even Stalin's good friend at one point and an ideological supporter for many years, grew disillusioned by what was going on in the USSR. Speaking of those in power, he said, quote, "They accepted terror as a normal administrative method and regarded obedience to all orders from above as a supreme virtue. They are no longer human beings. They have truly become the cogs in a terrible machine." End quote. And at the head of this horrible machine was a man who was crippled by paranoia and depression He even became an alcoholic. Stalin frequently killed anyone that was near him because he always inevitably became paranoid that they were trying to overthrow him or undermine him in some way. After just a couple of years in power, he had replaced nearly every single member of his personally selected cabinet of political advisors. Beginning in 1928, Stalin put on a number of show trials in which someone he deemed a potential threat was accused of some kind of heinous crime, generally tended to be something like sabotage or conspiring against the nation, treason, acting as enemies of the revolution, even. Stalin eventually purged anyone that could even pose a potential threat to his stronghold on political power. This meant that anyone who had any real standing and reputation as a competent communist, they were likely going to end up in a show trial or in a gulag. And keep in mind, this often included Stalin's own personal friends, people that had worked with him for decades. And then there's also the aspect that Stalin had essentially tricked himself into believing in his own greatness. Now, one of the really great resources I used in researching this entire project was the psychopathology of Joseph Stalin. And when you really take a deep look at it, you understand that Stalin's life was just dominated by all of these negative emotions. He may have been a really powerful person, he had anything he wanted physically, but he was not happy in any way. He suffered pretty much every day he was alive. And he was very aware of his own shortcomings, but he did everything he could to just convince himself that he was so great, that he was this supreme leader, this great ruler. I mean, every communist leader kind of has this God complex. So he had this terrible paranoia about everyone around him. But this paranoia that Stalin experienced was not limited towards others. It actually included himself. In real life, he knew that he wasn't all that great. He was an intelligent person and certainly a formidable man. But he was not a god. And that's what he was trying to make himself out to be. This is part of the reason that he censored and controlled every piece of media the people had access to. You were only allowed to say good things about Stalin, whether you were a newspaper reporter or a novelist or in radio, television, anything. If you had anything less than absolute admiration for Joseph Stalin, you were an enemy of the state. It actually got so bad that he outlawed religion, including Russian Orthodox, not because he had a problem with the teachings of Christ, but because he didn't want any competition. He controls his nation with an iron fist, and only had one serious setback in his whole career. And that's right after Hitler invaded during World War II, breaking their non-aggression pact. What most people don't know is that Stalin was actually planning on invading Germany 3 weeks after Hitler invaded Russia. Hitler simply beat him to the betrayal. These were two nations that were way too ideologically opposed to not have a war. It was going to happen sooner or later. These were two highly expansionistic and militarized countries that defined themselves along a very radical ideology. There's really no way this was going to be avoided in the long term. But Stalin was caught off guard by Hitler's invasion. He just wasn't ready for this. And expecting a swift defeat, Stalin left Moscow. He had something that's been described as a mental breakdown. His advisors had been warning him of the German invasion for weeks, but he just didn't listen. Now the invasion was here. His troops were ill-prepared. There weren't enough supplies, and now the Red Army had to withstand the wrath of this new military technique known as Blitzkrieg. 3 entire days. Joseph Stalin's people, his commanders, his generals, they had to come up to him and say, listen, you need to come back and save us. We're not going to do this without you. And after all of these days he finally got back into action. I couldn't even imagine what it must have been like to have been forced to serve in the Red Army during World War II. The worst part about the whole situation is that during the Great Purge, Stalin basically got rid of every competent military general in the Soviet Union. So the people that were in charge of the Red Army during World War II were some of the least qualified generals in the war at all, and probably in most of history. These are people that just did not deserve the job. But their superiors had just been purged. And because of the way the leadership structure is set up, you often have generals commanding soldiers to do things that were just against their best interests strategically and for the sake of their own lives. And throughout this war, Stalin passes a number of terrible laws concerning the Red Army. For example, if you get captured by the enemy, you are essentially treated as an enemy of the state because surrendering is against the interests of the Soviet Union. They want you to die fighting. There's another one where you can be severely punished if you give in any land to the Germans. Not one step back. And oftentimes, the way it was set up was there was the front line, and then there was someone behind the front line, and they basically had guns pointed at the people in the front line. They said, "You can't move or we're gonna shoot you." So you, as a soldier in the Red Army, you're standing there fighting the Germans who are advancing towards you, and then you also have someone behind you that might shoot you in the back of the head if you even, back up by a foot. Some crazy stuff. Now, despite these being some of the worst laws military personnel have ever been forced to live under, Stalin manages to turn the tide on Germany, and as we all know, he wins the war. There's a very important overlooked aspect of World War II that is very important for the way things actually transpired. And that was the massive abuse of human life by the Soviet Union at the end of the war. People in the West often talk about how cruel and inhumane the Soviet regime was up into the 1990s, but one of the things this fails to do is put into perspective of how historically bad things had been when Stalin was running the show, because by the time the 1990s came around, the Soviet regime had been watered down significantly in terms of human suffering. The suffering that was going on even in the late 80s was probably less than half of the suffering that was going on right after the revolution, and then especially during and shortly after the Second World War. It got so bad, in fact, there was a Yugoslavian communist, Milovan Gillis. He even complained to Stalin about how bad the atrocities were. We're talking mass killings, mass rapes, tortures, all of which was carried out by the Red Army. Stalin went on to defend the atrocities and the genocide and the torture done by the Red Army by asking how a normal soldier who had just lived through such a war could, quote, react normally. And what is so awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors? End quote. And if you think about it for a second, does that really surprise you? This is someone who doesn't care about the suffering of his own people, let alone the suffering of someone else's. The end of the Second World War was the pinnacle of Stalin's career. The way he ran the Soviet government and the control he exercised over all the communist states across the globe allowed him to influence the world we live in today. Of course, there was the Cold War following World War II, and part of the reason that the Cold War was partly inevitable was because of the fact that Western leaders saw and identified Stalin as the power-hungry sociopath that he was. So, surprisingly enough, the Cold War never erupted into an outright nuclear war, which, all things considered, is quite surprising, at the least. As you might imagine, there continued to be famine and disease and death under his leadership, and anyone who criticized communism or Stalin suffered immensely. It even got to a point where you weren't allowed to complain about life because, hey, you're living under the communist paradise, man. It doesn't get any better than this. Just a couple years later, Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and the really interesting part about Stalin's death is the fact that he may have been murdered. Though there's never really been any tangible evidence to say that he was, it would be absolutely understandable if someone had gone out of their way to poison or kill Stalin. He was responsible for the deaths of so many people and the suffering of so many more. And the really interesting part about Stalin is the way his legacy has kind of been twisted to fit various agendas. Communists around the world regard him as a hero and someone to be emulated, while many Russians think of him as a great nationalist hero for Russia, saving them from a European invasion. And that, my friends, was the life of Joseph Stalin. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. Don't forget to check out ourdarkhistory.com for more great historical content. Maybe even sign up to the email list while you're there. Thanks so much for listening all the way through. I really appreciate you. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.